The wrought iron hook holding the heavy door creaked once before falling silent, and Raven didn't even have time to turn around. He knew who it was by the footsteps, too heavy for an animal and too cautious for a casual visitor, and by the smell, a mixture of gasoline, cheap cologne, and government paper. Here, where the air was painfully clean, such a bouquet carried a distinct taste of civilization, vanity, and, invariably, trouble. The sun had already touched the tops of the distant ridges, bathing the hut in a final copper-red light that heralded a cold night. Raven sat at the table, cleaning an old Primus stove, and only the barely noticeable tension in the muscles of his arms revealed that he was perfectly aware of every rustle behind him. Sobolev, a major in the local police, froze in the doorway. He was a large man in a worn but neat uniform, and he always entered this small world with the feeling that he was breaking an unwritten law. An uninvited guest in these parts, he waited for permission that Raven never gave in words. Voron did not like to talk, did not like to explain, and especially did not like to receive visitors. But Sobolev was one of the few who understood the unspoken order of his life. The major waited a long half-minute before stepping into the room, and only then did Voron, without looking up, nod toward the only empty chair. "Sit down, Ignat." Raven's voice was like the whisper of the wind in dry pine trees, low and devoid of intonation. He continued his task, methodically polishing the brass body of the stove. An accident, I suppose. "You wouldn't have dragged yourself here 50 versts for paperwork." Ignat Sobolev sank heavily into a chair. The wood groaned beneath him. The dog, Shadow, who until that moment had been just a blur in the corner, raised his head. The dog's intelligent yellow eyes stared at the major without aggression, but with absolute, predatory concentration. Sobolev was not afraid. He was used to this silent control, which was much more effective than any weapon. "Unfortunate," Sobolev confirmed, pulling a folded sheet of paper from his inside pocket, which he immediately put back. He had no intention of showing the paper. It was only an anchor, and mystical at the same time. "I think it's for your soul, Raven. Listen carefully." Voron stopped polishing. The silence that hung in the hut became palpable. The only sound that broke the peace was the crackling of logs in the stove, which now seemed as loud as a gunshot. "A few weeks ago, in the Shamanka area, you know the place, a sect gathered," the major began, his hands folded on his knees. "They call themselves the Ascension community. A handful of fanatics, 20 or 25 people according to our data. They've been hanging out there for a long time, but they've never gone higher than the abandoned weather station. And then, 2 weeks ago, they went to the very top, to the very same stone glade, which is considered, well, you know, a place of power." Voron nodded. He knew that mountain. He knew every rock, every tree, every shift in the wind. For him, it wasn't a place of power, just a place where the laws of physics worked as they should. Ignoring mysticism was his way of surviving. "They were waiting there for their prophet," Sobolev continued with poorly concealed cynicism. "A certain Aristarchus, a man of 45, a former philosophy professor from some provincial university. He got carried away, gathered a following, and, importantly, made money." "Cash," Voron repeated, and for the first time, his voice showed genuine interest. "Tell me more." "Yesterday morning, according to their testimony, Aristarchus was supposed to ascend, a grand ceremony, candles, chants, collective psychosis in its purest form. All 24 people testified that he stood on the central stone, recited a mantra, enveloped in incense smoke, and disappeared. He simply vanished. Sobolev rubbed his forehead with his palm, as if to erase this absurd image. Our guys are there. Captain Kostin, 2 operatives. They've been searching for a day. All they found were burnt candles, smoke residue, and traces on the ground that indicate that Aristarch came to the clearing, but didn't leave. Neither down nor up. Just 0 traces of departure. The Major paused, allowing this fact, which was unbelievable from a logical point of view, to sink into Voron's mind. And now for the most interesting part, Voron. They don't have a body, but they don't have a bag either. The bag? Voron finally put down the stove. He took an old chipped glass from the shelf and silently poured a strong infusion of tiger herbs from the teapot, standing on the table. Sobolev didn't ask, but Voron handed him the glass. It was the highest sign of respect. A bag of money, clarified the Major, accepting the hot drink. Aristarch, as a competent shepherd, demanded that donations be made in cash, in gold, silver, or hard currency. No bag transfers. According to the sect's treasurer, a certain Svetlana, over the past few months they had collected enough money to buy a small house in the city. At least 4 million rubles. All this money was in an old canvas bag and was with the prophet during the ceremony. The bag is gone. The prophet is gone. What do you think? Asked Voron, his gaze sharp as a shard of ice. We think. Sobolev faltered, and his voice betrayed the weariness that distinguishes an honest man from a bureaucrat. Officially, we're leaning toward an accident. Maybe he slipped somewhere. Maybe he fell into a crevasse, and his body was buried. And the bag may have fallen with him. But it's too clean. No signs of a struggle. No panic. All 24 people, as one, insist on Ascension. They are ready to sign their lives away for it. Collective psychosis, yes. But then where are the 4 million rubles? Sobolev looked straight at Voron. You know I don't believe in fairy tales, and you don't believe in them either. I can't close the case until I find at least some bones, or at least a hint that the money was stolen. If the body disappeared, but the money disappeared with it, it could be suicide staged to look like mysticism. If the body disappeared and the money was stolen, it's murder. I can't conduct a normal investigation when witnesses quote Indian gods, but you can. You want me to find a body that ascended, Voron stated, picking up a piece of old thick fabric he had been using to polish the stove. His fingers moved slowly but purposefully. I want you to go and look at the logistics of this ascension, Sobolev corrected him. How, in your opinion, can you quietly, and without a trace, remove an adult man so that none of the 24 witnesses notice the substitution? And how can you take 4 million rubles at the same time? I'm not interested in their religion. I'm interested in their accounting. Voron stood up. He was a short, wiry man, but there was a power in his posture and his silence that made the Major feel like an awkward teenager. I'll be there, said Voron. He walked over to the only window and looked at Mount Shemenka. Its silhouette was stark and merciless against the darkening sky. He wasn't looking for mysticism in it. He was looking for mathematics, the laws of geometry, and traces of human greed. He had no doubt that the disappearance was a deception, carefully planned but humanly imperfect. Any crime is not a failure of the universe, but a failure of logistics. Ignorance, obsession with truth, and encounters with the inexplicable which Sobolev spoke of were all just background noise. At the center, there was always power, money, and human weakness. When? Sobolev asked, feeling the tension slowly recede from his shoulders. Now, replied Voron. He turned to gather his backpack. The shadow, as if on command, rose and silently approached its master. The dog, being the perfect tool for reading tracks and shadows, already knew that the calm was gone and that they had a journey ahead of them, full of lies and the smell of someone else's fear. Voron took his compass, knife, and old carbine. 4 million rubles. An amount for which people are willing to break not only the law of the taiga, but also their own. Ignat Sobolev would leave at dawn, and Voron and Shadow would go to the mountains to find the body and restore the balance that had been disturbed. It wasn't work. It was a need. A need to redeem the order that must always prevail over chaos. He didn't seek justice in books or laws. He sought it where it was woven into the very fabric of existence. A footprint on the ground does not lie. And water always flows downhill. The Major finished his tea and silently placed the glass on the table. He knew that Raven did not need a farewell or a send-off. Ignat just nodded briefly and left, leaving behind a silence that was now filled with anticipation. Voron remained alone in the hut, listening to the Major's footsteps recede, and then complete silence. He put on his backpack. His own disbelief in mysticism was his only, most reliable obsession with the truth. "Let's go," he whispered to Shadow. "We'll find the one who wanted to be God and count his sins." Deep night was falling when Raven and Shadow left their hut behind, now just a dim spot in the distance. The frosty, resinous air of the taiga squeezed his lungs. But the familiar tension in his muscles that came at the start of a long journey brought Raven a strange sense of calm. He did not walk along the road, but along a barely noticeable, ancient trail that had served him and his ancestors for centuries, winding between boulders and centuries-old cedars. The shadow, pressed tightly against its master's feet, moved almost silently, its yellow eyes seeming to absorb the light of the stars, missing not a single shadow or rustle. They covered the first 5 versts quickly, moving at a pace that was akin to the breathing of the earth itself, measured and relentless. Here, on the very edge of his world, the last pitiful signs of an abandoned civilization still remained. The remains of an old logging track, long since swallowed up by moss and ferns. A half-ruined hut that no one had visited since the mine closed. The Raven paid no attention to these traces. They were part of a past that had no power over the present. However, soon the path they were walking on began to change. It ceased to be wild, ceased to be just an animal trail laid along the path of least resistance. It became unnaturally clean. The Raven slowed its pace, bending down toward the ground. The ground here was covered with old pine needles, but someone's hand had carefully removed the recent autumn litter and scraped the wet turf off the stones, which could have revealed fresh tracks. Travelers going to a place of spiritual ascent usually do not care about such pedantic order. Fanatics, obsessed with the idea of ascension, tend to be chaotic, ignoring everyday life in the name of a greater goal. They leave behind traces of haste, fatigue, and distraction. But here, the work of people concerned not with the soul but with logistics was evident. The shadow stopped nearby, silently, and sniffed the air. The raven ran his fingers over the damp earth at the root of an old larch tree. Heavy shoes with stiff, grooved soles had clearly stood here, but no more than once. Ordinary tourists leave dozens of careless footprints, but sectarians following their prophet would have had to trample, wait, and perform rituals. But here, there was only one footprint, clear as a seal. The footprint of a man who knew exactly where to stand, to watch the trail, without disturbing the ground unnecessarily. The raven felt the first pang of a cold, unpleasant suspicion. They were not dealing with a crowd of exalted mystics, but with a group governed by strict, almost military discipline. As they went deeper into the mountains, the rough, difficult trails became more and more obviously worked. Approximately every 3 to 4 kilometers, where the slope became too steep, there were artificially reinforced steps made of tightly laid stones and earth embankments, which made the ascent much easier. It was hard, thankless work, done in advance, and it spoke of two things. First, the community had not gathered spontaneously, but had planned its trip to Mount Shamanka long before. And second, there were people among them with mountaineering skills, or more likely, former military engineers. No ordinary tourist or seeker of spiritual enlightenment would waste precious time and energy on laying such perfect, clean routes, unless it was part of rigorous, mandatory training. Further on, they came across a place to spend the night, which was arranged with the same meticulous, repulsive neatness. The sect members spent more than one night under a large rock overhang that served as a natural shelter from the wind. The fire pit was not simply smothered, but carefully dismantled. The ashes poured into a small pit and covered with moss. There were no traces of plastic, no scraps of rope, no forgotten details characteristic of the disorderly life of a large group of people. Only perfectly flat, trampled ground under the overhang and carefully stacked firewood left for the next unknown traveler. The raven looked around. His gaze swept over the trees, searching for traces that could not be hidden. The sectarians used large spruce branches to camouflage the camp so as not to attract attention from the air if someone suddenly flew over them. This was no ordinary windbreak. It was camouflage. He approached one of the stones and noticed a faint but clear line drawn on it, as if someone had marked the boundary of the camp area. This was not the handwriting of a believer, but that of a guard establishing a perimeter. "Control," Raven whispered to Shadow. The dog pricked up his ears, understanding the intonation. Discipline. Military precision. There was not a hint of the relaxation that spiritual unity should bring in the logistics of this sect. On the contrary, everything was subject to the strictest order, which was, in essence, the antithesis of any collective psychosis. People in religious ecstasy do not think about cleaning up every last crumb of trash after themselves. This is done by those who either hide their presence or are preparing for something very serious that requires complete concentration. Voron began to read the Ascension community like a military map. The prophet, Aristarchus, may have been their ideologue, their banner, but the person who ensured their stay in the mountains was someone else. Someone with an iron grip and complete indifference to mysticism. Someone who managed their finances, the treasurer, and their security, the chief of security. And it was these two people, according to Major Sobolev, who were the last to see both the missing leader and the bag with 4 million rubles.
His suspicions, which had arisen back in the hut, now in this remote mountain gorge, had turned into firm conviction. Murder for power and money, a banal ancient motive, was skillfully disguised as Ascension.
But the disguise was external, intended for those who view the world through the eyes of faith or skepticism, but not logic. The internal, operational part, however, was carried out with cold, calculated precision. And it was precisely in this precision that the flaw lay, which Voron was going to find. The higher they climbed, the sparser the forest became, and the more obvious the tracks became.
Voron noticed tracks that were too wide for mountain boots, most likely from a small wheelbarrow or sled used to carry heavy loads, provisions, fuel, and possibly that very canvas bag with cash.
The wheelbarrow was not needed by fanatics carrying their load with faith, but by pragmatists who were saving their strength for a more important task. The last stretch of the route ran along a rocky slope. Here it was impossible to hide the tracks, but even on this section, someone had used a sophisticated method. Where a track was inevitable, it was covered up by hundreds of other identical tracks, as if a group had walked the same route back and forth many times. This created the impression of a large number of people and chaos, but in fact, it was the perfect way to destroy individual footprints. By noon the next day, when the sun had already baked all the excess moisture out of the rocks, they reached the edge of the forest. A small semicircular valley opened up before them, and beyond it, higher up, loomed the silhouette of Mount Shamanka, its summit shrouded in low clouds. Directly in front of him, on a perfectly flat, artificially cleared area, Raven saw the sect's camp. A dozen identical tents, neatly arranged around a central point. And the first thing that caught his eye was not mystical attributes, but a strict, almost barracks-like order. This was not a place of ascension, but, judging by all appearances, a well-organized base. He stopped, hiding in the shadow of a centuries-old cedar tree. Shadow lay down next to him, resting her head on her paws, but her gaze was fixed on the camp. Through the clear mountain air came monotonous, mournful chants mixed with the smell of smoke from the fire and incense. Ignoring the sounds and smells that should have affected his emotions, Raven considered only logic. The camp awaited him, where collective psychosis was only a screen hiding a crime committed with cold and refined military precision. He knew that the one who directed these logistics was also the one who had eliminated the profit, taking millions. And now he was ready to enter their world, to begin his investigation. The sun hung high above Shamanka, but its light did not penetrate the valley completely, scattering in clouds of fog and the smell of smoldering incense. Raven entered the camp.
The first person to greet him was the man Major Sobolev had called Captain Kostin, a young but already weary operative with a feverish gleam in his eyes.
Kostin had clearly not slept for 2 days, and his irritation at the clash between mysticism and bureaucracy was almost palpable. Raven did not greet him, but simply nodded, silently, toward the mountain plateau. There, Kostin waved his hand. Up there. We've cordoned it off, but who are we supposed to arrest? The body hasn't gone anywhere, but it hasn't arrived either. It looks like something out of a movie, only without the special effects. There are 24 cult members here. They're all being questioned.
All as one, Ascension. They say the earth is being cleansed. The raven flew past him, ignoring the police commotion. The community itself, which should have been a model of mad, chaotic ecstasy, was striking in its discipline. The tents stood in neat rows. The bonfire burned moderately. The smoke rose straight up without touching the awnings. The members of the sect, people of all ages, from young men to grey-haired old men, sat on canvas mats, paying no attention to the police or the stranger. They looked somewhere in the distance, upward, and their faces wore the same expression. Calm, reverent stupor. It was collective psychosis, but controlled. Managed psychosis. Like a well-oiled but dead mechanism. He noticed two people who stood out from the crowd. They were not sitting in reverence, but were actively interacting with the police, answering questions, and giving orders to other cult members. They were obviously the treasurer and the head of security. The treasurer, Svetlana, was a woman of about 35, with stiff, pulled-back hair and an attentive, overly sober gaze. She was not wearing the loose clothing of a fanatic, but a practical mountain suit, and she was not looking at the sky, but at the ground, where their tents stood. The head of security, Anatoly, was a burly man with a dull face, but there was a hidden spring in his movements. He constantly kept his arms crossed over his chest, as if defending himself, or, on the contrary, preparing to attack. His gaze was not inspired, but alert. Voron climbed higher, to the place the sectarians called the portal. It was a small, perfectly round clearing, located between three huge, weathered boulders that did indeed resemble some kind of ancient altar. The police had already stretched yellow barrier tape across it, but Raven stepped over it indifferently. The center of the clearing was trampled, but not chaotically, rather around the main flat stone on which the prophet had apparently stood. Traces of soot and melted wax remained on the stone, evidence of the ceremony. Raven did not touch the mystical attributes. He bent down to the ground, ignoring the pile of small stones and dried grass. The main problem for the police was that there were no traces here. No traces of a struggle, which ruled out open violence. No traces of departure. The snow that had fallen a few days ago had melted and hardened, but its thin, loose layer at the very surface of the stone was untouched. A person who had walked, run, or crawled would have left a trace on this ground that could be read. Would Prophet Aristarchus had come to the clearing, and his tracks ended exactly where the ritual circle began, where his closest assistants had picked him up. The raven knelt at the edge of the stone. He noticed several things that had escaped the attention of the operatives. First, the prophet's footprints, soft leather sandals, which he wore as a symbol of his renunciation of the world. These footprints were light, superficial. Next to them, however, were distinct, deep prints from mountain boots with powerful treads. There were only 4 such prints, arranged symmetrically around the central stone, as if someone had been standing guard during the ceremony. Second, incense. The smell was strong, suffocating, even after a day. Raven knew that such strong aromatic resins were used not only for religious ecstasy, but also to mask other smells. What? Blood? Or, more likely, something chemical. Something sedative. Thirdly, there were no signs of the return of his closest aides. The sect members' testimonies were unanimous. Treasurer Svetlana and Security Chief Anatoly were with the prophet until the very end,
in the heart of the portal. They had to leave the circle to announce the Ascension to the congregation, but there were no traces of their departure either. Only traces of their arrival remained. It was as if all three, the prophet and his two closest associates, had disappeared at the same time. This was impossible, and therein lay the first obvious lie. If Svetlana and Anatoly were now in the camp giving testimony, then they must have left the clearing. But their tracks had disappeared under the indistinguishable footprints of the rest of the group, which, according to their own testimony, had descended to the camp after the Ascension. Voron stood up. He looked at the three boulders surrounding the portal. They were covered with lichen and moss, but on one of them, the largest, he noticed a barely noticeable, almost invisible, fresh chip. Not from an impact, but from friction, as if some object that was hard and had a sharp angle had rubbed against the stone. He returned to Kostin, who was waiting for him at the edge of the forest. "Captain." Voron's voice was even, without a hint of emotion. "I need to talk to two of your people, Svetlana and Anatoly. Without your people. Give me half an hour." Kostin hesitated. "They're under suspicion, Voron. If something goes wrong." "What could go wrong?" Voron looked at him in such a way that the operative had no doubts. "I'm not going to lecture them. I'm only interested in the logistics of the deception." Kostin sighed, his fatigue overcoming his professional duty. He nodded, and 10 minutes later, Svetlana and Anatoly were standing in front of Voron at the tent that served as their makeshift headquarters. The cultists continued to sing their mournful songs, ignoring what was happening. The shadow, like a faithful guard, sat behind Voron. Her presence was not a threat, but an insurmountable barrier. Voron began his questioning, which at first glance had nothing to do with the disappearance. He did not talk about faith, the soul, or miracles. "Who was in charge of provisions?" he asked Svetlana. The treasurer flinched at the unexpected question, but immediately pulled herself together. "I was. Donations. The funds we collected went to support the community. How many bags of grain, bags of flour, and cans of food were purchased?" Voron did not raise his voice, but his question was sharp and precise. "And how often?" Svetlana gave the figures and quantities. Anatoly, the head of security, stood nearby, his face stony, but Raven saw his eyes darting nervously between Svetlana and Raven, trying to understand where this interrogation was leading. "Why so much? Were you planning to stay here for 6 months?" asked Voron. "We were preparing for a long spiritual journey," replied the treasurer, but her voice was too smooth, too rehearsed. "After the prophet's ascension, we had to stay here, in this place of power, to absorb the energy." "Who was responsible for the routes and setting up the tents?" Raven turned to Anatoly. "I was," replied the chief of security tersely. "I have experience. I was a mountain tourist. You put steps on the ascent, and you camouflaged the camp with fir branches. Who were you hiding from?" The question hit the mark. Anatoly immediately tensed up. "We weren't hiding," he muttered. "We were just protecting ourselves from the wind. That's what the prophet Aristarchus commanded. He wanted us to be invisible to the world." "How did you communicate?" Voron turned back to Svetlana. "There's no cell phone coverage here. Did you have a satellite phone?" The treasurer answered quickly, too quickly. "No, we completely cut ourselves off from the world. We are isolated." Voron turned to Anatoly and looked him straight in the eye. "You have a radio," he said simply, as if stating a fact. It's tuned to two frequencies, one for communication between the camp and the glade, the other for communication with the outside world. Which, I might add, was working this morning, according to Kostin's testimony. Anatoly remained silent. Svetlana, the treasurer, shot the head of security a quick, murderous glance. There was no bitterness or fear in that glance. Only rage that he had made such a mistake. And at that moment, Voron understood. Their behavior was not grief or joy at a wonderful event, but tense, joint control over the situation. They were not idealistic sectarians. They were accomplices, united not by faith, but by 4 million rubles. I'll ask one last question. Raven looked at them both. Which one of you saw the bag of money last? And who prepared the portal for the ceremony? Their answers were synchronized, but contradicted each other. Svetlana said, "The bag was with the prophet until the very last minute. He prepared the portal himself. Anatoly just stood nearby." Anatoly said, "Svetlana took the bag when the prophet entered the circle. She was also responsible for purifying the portal so that Aristarchus could easily enter the light." The ice was broken. Their rehearsed legend of Ascension did not stand up to logistical scrutiny. Raven knew that his work was just beginning. He returned to the headquarters tent, leaving Treasurer Svetlana and Security Chief Anatoly with their nervous, newly shattered legend. They went back to their world, to their disciplined but exalted followers, while Raven remained alone with cold logic. The inconsistency in their statements was too obvious. Each of them sought to absolve themselves of responsibility for the last contact with the prophet, and, more importantly, with the bag containing 4 million rubles. It was there, in these contradictions, that the truth lay hidden. Svetlana lied about who had prepared the portal. Voron saw the traces left by Anatoly, clear prints of his mountain boots, symmetrically arranged around the central stone. This was not the position of an assistant in the ritual, but of a guard, or more precisely, an executor, who was supposed to control the process. Her lie was intended to shift all responsibility for organizing the scene of the disappearance onto the guard. Anatoly lied about the bag. If Svetlana, the treasurer, had really taken the bag in her hand so that the prophet could easily enter the light, she would not have been so quick and decisive in denying the existence of the satellite connection he was clearly using. Her attention was focused not on the spiritual, but on the material. His lie was a cover for her main goal: financial resources. The Raven knew that his next move should focus not on what happened in the clearing, but on what was happening around it. He returned to the portal. Like a shadow, remained below, near the tent, watching Svetlana and Anatoly. Her task was simple: to watch their movements, where they looked, what they paid attention to. Any criminal, returning to the scene of their triumph, unwittingly gives themselves away by focusing their gaze on the point that causes them the most tension. In the clearing, Voron once again examined the boulder on which he had noticed a chip. The chip was small, fresh, and located about 60 centimeters above the ground. He ran his fingers over it, an uneven, rough mark left by something heavy and canvas-like. It was not a blow, but friction from dragging or lowering. If the prophet had ascended, where did this mark come from? And if the prophet Aristarchus, a man in soft sandals, had come to the clearing on foot, what had been dragged across the stones? The Raven moved away from the boulder, continuing to search for what disturbed the natural order. He was looking not for human footprints, but for traces of cargo. An unnatural trace is one that does not fit into the overall picture. Amidst the chaos of small stones, pine needles, and the footprints of sectarians, he stumbled upon something that immediately caught his attention. On the ground, at the very edge of the forest, about 10 meters from the portal, a young fir branch was broken. It was broken sharply, not under the weight of snow or wind, but as if it had been caught and pulled aside by some object moving off the trail. The branch was broken at a height unusual for normal human movement, about 1.20 meters from the ground. Running his hand over the broken section, Voron felt that the bark was scratched in one direction, from the clearing to the forest. It couldn't have been a random tourist walking with a backpack, because their path would have been lower. It was an object that had been dragged along the ground, and then, apparently, lifted to be thrown over a fallen tree or large boulder. He crouched down, examining the ground beneath a broken branch. And there it was, what the police had ignored, fixated on mysticism and searching for a body in the crevices. In the ground, covered with old pine needles and leaves, there was an unnaturally deep and straight furrow. The groove, no wider than 2 palms, was shallow, but its straightness and length, about 5 meters, suggested that something heavy and long had been dragged here, and it had been done with care so as not to leave an obvious trail. Someone had then tried to cover the groove with pine needles. The raven carefully raked the pine needles aside with the tip of his knife. The ground was damp and trampled, but more importantly, it contained small pieces of tarpaulin, and, even more tellingly, a faint but distinct smell of urine and sweat. It was the smell of fear, or, more likely, the effects of a strong sleeping pill. Next to this groove, he noticed another detail. On the soft, damp soil, which left almost no footprints, he found a heel mark. It was not Anatoly's mountain boot, nor the prophet's sandals. It was a neat, small heel, characteristic of women's, albeit hiking, shoes. There was only one footprint, but it was very clear, as if the person had stood there one last time to check how well the dragging furrow was camouflaged. Svetlana, the treasurer, impeccably neat and pragmatic, wore exactly such shoes. The picture was coming together. The disappearance was carefully planned, but not mystical. In the midst of collective psychosis created by chance, incense smoke, which could mask the smell of the intoxicating substance, and the atmosphere of a place of power, Prophet Aristarchus was drugged or killed before his body touched the ground. Then his was wrapped in tarpaulin, most likely the same tarpaulin that was usually used to wrap the bag with 4 million. And he was secretly carried away from the clearing with the help of a primitive sled or wheelbarrow. Anatoly was responsible for ensuring that no one left the circle, while Svetlana, with her neat high heels, controlled the cover-up of the trail at the edge of the forest. Their lies during the interrogation were not an attempt to avoid punishment for mysticism, but an attempt to share responsibility for the murder and theft. Voron followed with his eyes the direction in which the groove he had just discovered was leading. It did not lead upward, toward a mythical ascension, but downward, in the opposite direction from the camp, toward a dense, impenetrable forest, where, according to his knowledge of the area, a mountain river flowed, and an old, abandoned road ran that had not been used for 20 years. The prophet had been taken away. All that remained was to find the body and the money, but most importantly, to find confirmation of this logistics. Raven knew that his next move should be directed at the treasurer.
If she was responsible for the money, then she must have records. No financier, even in a sect, trusts such a sum to memory alone. He returned to the camp. Shadow, having received an unspoken order, was already watching Svetlana's tent closely. The treasurer, returning after the interrogation, immediately set about her daily tasks. But her movements were sharp and uncertain. She would approach her tent, then move away from it, casting short, tense glances in Anatoly's direction. Voron walked past her, pretending not to notice her at all, and headed for his makeshift camp, where he unfolded a mat to rest on. He did not approach Svetlana. Instead of interrogating her, he began to observe her habits, how she interacted with her personal space. She took a small backpack out of the tent and began to rummage through it. It was a classic psychological technique. A person under pressure begins to engage in routine, familiar activities to restore the illusion of control. She checked her provisions and counted her personal belongings. Then, with unnatural carelessness, she approached a large boulder that served as a kind of table or shelf and adjusted a stone lying on it. The stone was ordinary, unremarkable, but the way she adjusted it was too careful. The raven waited until she walked away to talk to one of the cultists. The cultist listened to her with shining eyes, as if she were a prophetess, which only emphasized her new role. The raven approached the boulder. He did not lift the stone she had just adjusted. He ran his hand under it, where the stone touched the ground. The earth was too soft. Someone had obviously recently removed and replaced this stone. He lifted the stone. Underneath it, in a shallow but dry niche, lay a bundle wrapped in old, oil-stained cloth. Inside was not a bag of money, but a thick, worn-out accounting journal. The raven opened it. The first pages were devoted to records of donations. Dates, names, amounts, all in rubles and currency. Ignat Sobolev was right. The amount was enormous, but in the middle of the journal, Svetlana's handwriting changed. It became clearer, more businesslike. And here, it was not donations that were recorded, but expenses, large, regular purchases. A satellite phone, mountain equipment, industrial containers. The purchase records ended exactly 3 days before the prophet's ascension. Voron had in his hands not just an accounting journal, but an escape plan, and, more importantly, a perfect alibi. The murder was not committed by fanatics, but by cold-blooded, calculating criminals who hid behind the mask of collective psychosis. He had a lead, and it led not upward to mysticism, but downward to the river and the abandoned road. He hid the journal. Now he knew not only how it happened, but why. All that remained was to find the place where they had dumped the body, to eliminate the only clue that could destroy their legend of Ascension. The raven ignored their confusion, their contradictions, their obvious lies. The argument about who was holding the bag was nothing more than a smokescreen, created to distract attention. He did not seek a confession from them, which would most likely be false or incomplete. He was not interested in the psychology of guilt, but in the physics of the crime. How, at what speed, and in what direction the prophet Aristarchus had been moved. He already had an understanding, but now he had to prove it to the earth. He moved away from the camp. The shadow followed him, keeping its eyes on the forest, in the direction of which they had already found a faint but definite trail. Leica was the perfect tool for this. A person can learn not to leave traces.
or to skillfully mask them, but the smell remains. And an animal living by the laws of nature always senses a disturbance in the order. They returned to the portal, but Raven did not linger there. He crossed the clearing and headed for the very broken branch at the edge of the forest that he had discovered earlier. Here, on the border between open and closed space, the most serious mistakes always occur.
It is here, in their haste, that criminals commit acts that cannot be attributed to natural wear and tear or accident. Voron knelt down.
He raked away the pine needles, exposing the very groove he had seen before. A shallow, straight furrow left by dragging. Now he applied a method he called detective naturalist. He was not looking for prints, but for disturbances in the natural balance.
And in this, he was a master, because he knew the taiga not as a landscape, but as a complex, living system, where each element is in strict interaction with the others. He noticed that, in addition to the drag mark, there were tiny, barely noticeable scratches in the ground, spaced at regular intervals. These scratches were shallow and were not made by Svetlana's heel, but by something metal with a sharp angle. These were obviously the fastenings or runners of a sled or improvised cart on which they had carried the body down. The fact that they had used a mechanical device confirmed his suspicion. They had not dragged the body themselves, risking fatigue and attracting attention, but had used logistics suitable for heavy loads. The drag marks had been carefully covered up, but the meltwater flowing down the mountainside had not yet completely washed them away. Raven took a pinch of soil. It smelled not only of pine needles, but also of something musty and heavy, which could have been the smell of resin-soaked tarpaulin. He continued to follow this trail, which was invisible to the naked eye, but obvious to anyone who knew how to read the ground.
Every 10 to 15 meters, the trail almost completely disappeared, only to reappear again. This meant that they had either carefully carried the load across open areas or simply camouflaged it.
But in one place, where the trail dropped sharply down to a small waterfall, the camouflage was done with surprising carelessness, as if the people dragging the body felt they were out of sight of the camp and relaxed. Where the trail was paved with larger, flat stones, Raven found what he was looking for: Svetlana's heel print. But not just one, 2 or 3. She had clearly stumbled here, dragging the load behind her. But that wasn't the most important thing. On one of the flat stones that served as a step, there was a smudged footprint. It was blurred, but Voron determined with absolute certainty that it was part of the tread of Anatoly's mountain boot. But the footprint had not been made during a normal step, but during a sharp breaking or jerk. It was as if Anatoly had been holding something very heavy from falling down, or had jerked it sharply toward himself. Voron followed this barely visible trail for about an hour, moving further and further away from the camp. The path became steeper and more dangerous. No ordinary sectarian, no tourist would take this route without extreme necessity. This path was chosen not for spiritual ascent, but for a secret descent. It led to an old, abandoned riverbed, which turned into a raging torrent in the spring but was now almost dry, strewn with large pebbles. And here, where the riverbed crossed their trail, Raven discovered something that completely confirmed his guess. The trail left on the wet, sandy soil was more obvious. These were tire tracks that clearly did not belong to a regular car, but to some kind of light all-terrain vehicle or quad bike. The tracks were covered with small pebbles, but their depth and pattern indicated that the vehicle had been there recently, and that it was carrying a heavy, oversized load. Nearby, under a rock overhang, he found several stones arranged
as if they were covering something. The raven moved them aside with his foot. Under the stones lay scraps of thin plastic film, which had probably been used to wrap the body so that it would not stain the tarpaulin, as well as an empty plastic container that had once held industrial oil. And finally, under one of the stones he found a small brass fragment. It was part of a fastener characteristic of old army tarpaulin. All the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The prophet Aristarchus had been drugged, sewn into a canvas bag that could be mistaken for a bag of money, and dragged down from the clearing to the old riverbed. There, below, Anatoly was waiting for him with a quad bike. Treasurer Svetlana, with her neat high heels, helped with the most difficult, upper section, where it was necessary to ensure silence and camouflage from the camp. The disappearance was carefully planned, but not mystical. The prophet had been carried away. It was a murder for power and money. The mysticism was just a perfect, invented backdrop, a collective psychosis that was supposed to provide the killers with an alibi and time to escape. Raven turned to Shadow. Leica stood up, her eyes focused. "Now we're coming for you," Raven said, addressing the invisible trail. He knew that the bag of money was most likely still in the camp, or somewhere nearby, so as not to risk losing it during the descent. The killers, Svetlana and Anatoly, had staged the Ascension to buy time while the police searched for the Ascended in the heavens or in the crevices. But their time was running out. They had failed to upset the balance of the taiga. Now it was time for atonement, which always follows a violation of order. Voron returned to the logbook he had hidden under a rock near his tent. He had to find another final clue in Svetlana's notes, a clue that would reveal where the prophet's body had been dumped. Why buy industrial containers, if not to get rid of organic material? He had no doubt that the prophet's body had not gone far. It was here, in the taiga, like unwanted waste that had to be hidden in the deepest pit so that it would not return. A new round of investigation began, leading him not to search for traces of the murder, but to search for traces of its concealment. Voron opened the journal, which smelled of dampness and Svetlana's expensive cologne. On the last written page, at the very bottom, there was only one short, almost illegible note made in pencil. W.D.P. He knew it was an abbreviation, and he knew what it meant. Waste Disposal Pit. And judging by the careful preparation, this pit had to be deep and reliable, like a grave. The raven sat on a fallen cedar tree at the very edge of the camp, pretending to be busy cleaning an old hunting knife. His movements were slow and methodical, but his gaze, hidden under a wide hood, did not leave Svetlana's treasurer. He knew that in a situation like this, with 4 million rubles and freedom at stake, people stopped being mystics and became pure pragmatists. The psychology of survival dictated that Svetlana not only lie to the police about the Ascension, but also prepare a backup plan. No one who plans to flee with a large sum of money trusts chance and keeps their plan in their head. There must be a physical medium linking the money, the route, and the destination. Svetlana, returning to her tent, was the picture of nervous concentration. She diligently feigned reverent grief while communicating with other sect members, who now revered her as one of the close to the light. But Raven saw her hands tremble as she adjusted the edge of the tent, and her eyes constantly scanned the perimeter, searching not for God, but for danger. She knew her lie about the bag in the portal had been exposed. She knew that Raven, this uninvited guest in a tattered cloak,
did not believe in mysticism. He waited for her to make a mistake, for her need for control to overcome her caution.
Raven understood that the logbook or other compromising materials could not be in the tent, which could be searched by the police at any moment. They had to be nearby, within reach, but securely hidden. The place she chose had to be logical in terms of her habits and functionality. After half an hour of pointless fussing, Svetlana finally approached a group of boulders that served as a kind of kitchen and work table for her. It was the perfect place. A natural storage area, where things were constantly being moved and tidied away, and where anyone's curiosity about these stones would not raise any questions. She bent down, as if adjusting a camping stove, and did what Raven had already noticed. Carefully, with unnatural ease, she moved one of the stones. It was not too big, but not small either. Enough to cover the hiding place, but not too heavy to be quickly removed. The shadow lying next to Voron raised its head, its nose twitching in the air. Laika smelled not only the scent of damp earth, but something else. The smell of paper and human tension. Svetlana quickly, almost instinctively, reached under the boulder and pulled out a small package wrapped in oilcloth. She immediately hid it under her coat. The whole process took no more than 10 seconds, and to anyone who wasn't watching her closely, it looked like a normal, everyday movement. Voron knew that the package must contain something critically important. The key to escape, coordinates, or more likely, notes. But he couldn't risk open conflict to take it. He had to give her a chance to feel safe. Svetlana went into her tent to study her notes. Voron, making sure she was busy, slowly got up. He did not go to her tent, but in the opposite direction, to the police cordon, pretending to consult with Captain Kostin. "Captain," he said, addressing the operative who was bored by his campfire, "I need all the data on the treasurer and the head of security, their biographies, where they worked, when they joined the sect, urgently." While Kostin fiddled with his radio, transmitting the request to the city, Voron quietly returned to the boulders. He repeated Svetlana's movement, lifted the stone, and saw the niche. The hiding place was dry and clean, and it was empty. Svetlana had taken the package with her when she received it. Voron turned toward her tent. He could no longer see it. He was interested in another hiding place, the one she had used before. A hiding place that was intended not for immediate access, but for long-term storage. He returned to the boulder and carefully examined the ground around it. And there it was, 50 centimeters from where the stone lay. Raven noticed another, slightly larger boulder. Unlike the first one, this stone was not used by Svetlana as a shelf. It was embedded in the ground and covered with moss. However, Raven noticed a thin, barely noticeable crack at its base. He pressed on the stone. It did not move, but the moss came away under light pressure, exposing fresh, loose earth beneath it. The stone was a decoy. He carefully walked around it and noticed a third boulder, which was several times larger. It was, in fact, part of the rock. But it was under it, in the shade, that Raven noticed a thin line drawn on the ground. A line that was not natural. He bent down. At the base of this boulder, where it disappeared into the ground, there was a small crack, covered by a couple of small, ordinary stones. Raven removed them. Inside, in a deep and completely dry niche, lay a package wrapped in oilcloth, which was already old and worn. The one she had used for storage before hiding her work material. Inside was a thick leather notebook containing the double-entry bookkeeping. The first pages, as he had expected, were records of donations. Aristarchus, the prophet, was meticulous about money and demanded strict accounting. But further on, in the middle, the entries changed in character, becoming dry, technical, and devoid of spiritual pathos. It was an expense and logistics log. Voron read it, and each item was another nail in the coffin of their legend of Ascension. Turaya satellite phone, model such and such, mountain equipment, carabiners, ropes, total length 100 meters. Quad bike, 2 months rental payment, storage location. Abandoned hut by the river. Industrial containers, 4 pieces, for organic waste disposal, acid, volume 100 liters. Even with his stingy attitude toward emotions, Voron felt a cold wave of conscious truth. Everything had been planned out. Everything had been taken into account. Aristarch's murder was not a spontaneous act, but the culmination of a long, carefully prepared plan, the goal of which was 4 million rubles and control over the sect, which was to become an ideal, unsuspecting asset. Svetlana was not the prophet's treasurer, but his executioner and future leader, with a plan ready to bring the community out of the mountains. He returned to the latest entries. Svetlana had apparently been planning her escape, not yet knowing that she would have to improvise with the police. The very last entry had been made just a week before the Ascension and was outlined in red pencil as particularly important. It was obviously a map. Coordinates, or even simpler, an abbreviation. YSO, Voron read, realizing that it meant waste disposal pit. And next to it, in parentheses, was a note. Tunnel, mark 830 meters. A tunnel, an abandoned mine, or an old quarry that they had bought or rented under the guise of a warehouse. The industrial containers of acid were intended to completely destroy the body, turning it into nothingness, thus confirming the mystique of Ascension. But something went wrong. Perhaps there wasn't enough time, or the acid was too weak, or they were scared off by the arrival of the police. Voron put the magazine in his backpack, returning both stones to their places. The psychology of survival turned out to be simple. Greed always leaves a paper trail. Now he had a route and a destination. He glanced again at Svetlana, who had emerged from the tent looking like a newly minted prophetess. She was looking at the clouds, engaged in a leisurely, reverent conversation with her followers. But Raven knew she felt trapped. He waited. She would need to check her backup exit. She would need to leave. He quietly called to Shadow. "Down," Raven commanded, "to the tunnel, mark 830. He knew that the body of the prophet Aristarchus, the man who dreamed of light, was waiting for him in a deep, dark pit. And he knew that this corpse would be the culmination of his investigation and the beginning of the end for the treasurer and the chief of security. Voron no longer had any doubts. Treasurer Svetlana's logbook was not just a financial report, but a complete plan for the crime. The purchase of mountain equipment, the rental of a quad bike, industrial containers. All these details indicated that the goal was not only murder for money, but also the complete, methodical concealment of the body. With this plan in his hands, and knowing the direction in which the drag marks led,
Voron did not return to the camp. He had to use the time that the police were wasting on pointless interrogations of excited sectarians to reconstruct the full course of events. Hiding the magazine in his backpack, Raven and Shadow moved downhill in the direction indicated by the drag marks and confirmed by common sense. From the camp to the abandoned road leading to the river, the shortest and most secretive route for transporting heavy cargo. This route was ignored by the police, who were focused on the top of the mountain. But it was the only logical one from a logistical point of view. The descent was steep and dangerous, but Raven moved quickly, as if the tiger itself was helping him. He used his tracking skills to read the invisible route. In one place, where the trail was almost a sheer cliff, Raven noticed traces of recent use of climbing equipment. Thin, barely noticeable scratches on the rocks left by carabiners. This confirmed that Anatoly, the head of security, was not just a mountain tourist as he had said, but a man with industrial climbing or mountain training skills, which allowed him to safely lower heavy, oversized loads using ropes, the purchase of which was noted in Svetlana's logbook. The drag mark, covered by pine needles, led them further, to a place where the sound of the mountain stream grew louder, drowning out the sounds of the forest. The Raven discovered the spot where the canvas bag had probably been overloaded. Here, under a thick layer of moss, he found an untouched patch of soil that had clearly been pressed down not by a human foot, but by a flat, heavy object. Several large stones lay nearby, which, judging by their position, had been used as supports. This was the place where the prophet's body, wrapped in canvas, had been waiting to be transported by quad bike. A few minutes later, they came to a dry stream bed that led straight to an old logging road. The road was abandoned, but its gravel surface allowed the vehicle to move fairly quickly and quietly. Here, in the deep shade of centuries-old fir trees, Raven found what he was looking for. The quad bike tracks had been covered with remarkable care. Anatoly had apparently spent more than an hour camouflaging them with stones, branches, and moss. However, his efforts were aimed at hiding the tracks from the eyes of a casual passerby, not from the eyes of a tracker. Voron removed the covering stones. The tread pattern was clear, leading down to an abandoned, dead-end tunnel. Nearby, in the thickets, Raven discovered the remains of their makeshift base. Several empty mineral water bottles and disposable gloves. And most importantly, a deep, clear imprint left by Anatoly's boot when he apparently crouched down to camouflage the tire tracks. Voron paused, allowing himself to reconstruct the scene. The prophet Aristarchus had been drugged, wrapped in tarpaulin, and then dragged downhill using climbing equipment and a sled. Down by the stream, a quad bike was waiting for them, on which the body was transported along the old road to the disposal site. Treasurer Svetlana and Security Chief Anatoly, having staged the Ascension, gained time. While the cult members were in ecstasy and the police were searching for the body in the mountains, the killers planned to calmly finish their work. However, they made a critical mistake. They staged the disappearance so that no one would look for the body. But in doing so, they left a bag with 4 million rubles in the camp. This was the key to unraveling their double game. They couldn't take the money right away, because it would immediately undermine the legend of the Ascension and turn the treasurer into a suspect. Their plan was to first get rid of the body, and then, under the guise of temporarily preserving the spiritual heritage of the prophet, leave with the money. Voron knew that their plan must now be in its most vulnerable phase. They must have sensed his presence in the camp, seen his interest in logistics and finances. Svetlana was undoubtedly checking to see if he had touched the cash and preparing herself and Anatoly for an immediate escape.
They needed to get to the tunnel quickly to finally get rid of the body and then leave via a prepared route that had been laid out specifically for the ATV and the cart to the agreed location. At that moment, the shadow, who was standing at the edge of the road, suddenly sniffed. Laika whimpered quietly but insistently, crouching down to the ground. It was not the scent of an animal. It was the scent of a human who had passed by here very recently. "They're not in a hurry," whispered Raven. He realized that the treasurer and the head of security had not waited for the police to leave. They sensed a threat in his questions and decided to flee immediately, taking the money with them. Raven moved forward, and now he was not looking for traces of the past, but pursuing a fresh, alarming trail leading to the tunnel.
The trail had been covered carelessly, in a hurry. It was the trail of Anatoly's boots and Svetlana's neat but nervous footsteps. They had come down here to make sure that the prophet's body was safely hidden.
They were heading for the place that was supposed to be their salvation, but would turn out to be a trap for them.
The descent became steeper. The forest gave way to rocky terrain, and soon a dark, gaping hole appeared. The entrance to an abandoned tunnel, which Svetlana had marked in her journal as YSO. Voron slowed his pace. He didn't know what awaited him inside. A locked entrance, or worse. Anatoly waiting for him, ready to defend his 4 million to the last drop of blood. He knew only one thing. Here, in this deep, dark pit, the mysticism ended, and the most prosaic, but no less tragic, truth began. He took out his carbine. The time had come for the climax. The mouth of the tunnel gaped in the rock like a black wound. It was not just a hole in the mountain, but a real portal, only not to the heavenly light as the prophet Aristarchus believed, but to the most prosaic and disgusting human greed. The dark chasm was crudely camouflaged. Scattered branches, old, rusty sheets of iron, broken boxes. The place that was listed in Svetlana's treasurer's journal as WDD, Waste Disposal Pit. The Raven stopped 20 meters from the entrance. Fresh tracks from an ATV and a couple of footprints from Security Chief Anatoly's mountain boots led straight to this pit and ended abruptly in front of it. The killers had obviously been here recently, checking their hideout before escaping. Voron took a flashlight out of his backpack. He unclipped Shadow's leash, giving her freedom of action. "Search," he ordered quietly. The Laika, who until that moment had been following the trail with hunting concentration, suddenly changed her behavior. She stopped looking for fresh tracks, and on the contrary, began to sniff the ground cautiously. She wasn't looking for Anatoly or Svetlana. She was looking for something that disturbed the natural order of the taiga. The smell of death, covered by earth and debris. The shadow led Voron not to the tunnel itself, but to a small round pit located about 15 meters away from the main entrance. It was a depression in the ground, covered with a large number of fir branches, moss, and construction debris. The place looked like a natural landfill, but upon closer inspection, Raven noticed that the debris had been laid out in a specific order. First branches, then stones, then household waste, and on top, another layer of moss, as if someone had tried to recreate the natural surface. The shadow stopped at this spot and began digging in the ground. It worked quietly and methodically, removing moss and branches, as if it knew exactly what was underneath. Voron joined it. He removed several layers of debris, mostly old plastic bottles and torn tarpaulin, and then, under a thin superficial layer of earth,
a dense, dark material appeared. The raven carefully cleared away the find. It was an old, heavy canvas bag.
The very one in which, according to Svetlana's testimony, 4 million rubles were kept. But this bag was not full of gold. It was filled with something organic, heavy, and irregular in shape. The climax came quietly, without drama or shouting. It was not mysticism that worked, but simple, dirty crime logistics. Voron cut the old, tightly tied rope that was constricting the neck of the bag. He pulled back the edge of the tarpaulin, and in the dim light of the lantern, a face appeared. The face of the prophet Aristarchus. It was pale, distorted not by horror, but by the peacefulness brought on by strong sedatives. Aristarchus did not ascend in a moment of ecstasy. He was drugged, sewn into his own money bag, and thrown here. Next to his head, on the tarpaulin, Raven noticed a small, neat hole soaked with dark, dried blood. The hole was too small for a bullet. Raven knew what it was. It was a point-blank shot from something quiet, powerful, but not a firearm. Probably a modified construction pistol that fires dowels, or a harpoon gun. Something that ensures a quiet, instant kill and doesn't cause unnecessary noise in the camp. The prophet was killed before or immediately after the ceremony began, at the moment when his followers, intoxicated by incense and collective psychosis, were ready to believe in a miracle. He was cold-bloodedly eliminated. The motive was now confirmed, not only by logistics, but also by the body. Murder for power and 4 million rubles. Svetlana and Anatoly staged the Ascension to divert attention from the body and the money. Voron closed the tarpaulin. He did not call the police. If he did so now, Svetlana and Anatoly, who undoubtedly felt that they were being exposed, would simply run away. He knew that they had not left yet. Their greed prevented them from doing so. The bag of money was obviously still in the camp or in their possession. Their plan was to make sure the body was securely hidden, then return to the camp, collect the money, and leave via the abandoned road on a quad bike. Raven examined the pit. There were no signs of the acid Svetlana had purchased being used. This confirmed his thinking. The killers had not had time to completely dispose of the body. They had been scared off either by the arrival of the police or something else. The body had been hastily covered with dirt and debris. He got up. He knew he had to use their own greed against them. They were afraid that someone would find traces on the way down, and they couldn't start their escape until they were sure that the path was completely clear. Raven left the body in the pit. He did not disturb the integrity of the crime scene. He simply used it as a reference point for his own philosophical justice. Now that he had a corpse and a logbook, he could afford to play their game. He returned to the trail leading to the abandoned road, where they had loaded the body onto the ATV. Raven looked at the sun, which was already sinking toward the horizon. He only had a few hours. He knew that Svetlana and Anatoly would not wait for dawn. They would leave under cover of darkness. His plan was simple, not to trap them, but to make their trap too obvious. Raven had to show them that their trail had been discovered and force them to return to clean it up. Their greed and confidence in their impunity would not allow them to abandon their carefully planned route. They would return to make sure it was clean, and then he would meet them. He turned and, without looking back, followed the trail leading back to the camp. He knew that he was no longer just looking for a body. He was restoring the disturbed order, and the tiger does not forgive those who violate its laws. for the sake of 4 million rubles.
The hunt for vultures had begun. Voron did not waste precious time contacting Captain Kosten.
The news of the prophet's body being found in an abandoned tunnel would immediately cause a commotion in the camp, and Svetlana and Anatoly, sensing the noose tightening, would immediately flee, taking 4 million rubles with them.
His goal was not simply to find the corpse, but to restore order, to catch the killers red-handed with the body and the money, and to ensure that their crime would not be attributed to a mystical Ascension. To do this, he had to act quietly, using their own greed and self-confidence against them. He returned to the section of the trail that led from the portal down to the place where the body was transferred to the ATV. This path, carefully camouflaged, was their Achilles' heel. They knew the police were searching the mountains, but any breach of camouflage, even the slightest, on this descent, could destroy their legend.
Voron chose the most difficult spot on the trail, a narrow, steep section where the drag marks were particularly deep and where Anatoly had used climbing equipment to control the load.
Here, on solid ground, covered only by a thin layer of moss, was the only clear imprint of Svetlana's heel when she slipped. It was this track that they had to consider the most vulnerable. Voron began to act. He did not destroy the camouflage, but broke it in one place, making the mistake too noticeable.
He took a large, flat stone from the edge of the trail that clearly did not belong there, and deliberately, carelessly placed it directly on top of the quad bike track they had so carefully hidden.
Then he moved the stone, but not completely, leaving a clear imprint of his own boot on the freshly covered ground, and did not cover it up. It was an unnatural disturbance,
A stone out of place, and a fresh, careless footprint that did not belong to the sectarians. Anyone walking along this path would sense that something was wrong here.
but Svetlana and Anatoly, who knew how carefully they had camouflaged this area, would perceive this not as an accident, but as a direct indication that their trail had been discovered. Their greed would not allow them to simply escape by another route, abandoning the 4 million rubles that were most likely still in the camp. Moreover, their confidence that they had thought everything through would force them to return here to correct their mistake. They would have to remove this rock, camouflage the trail again, and make sure that the path for their escape remained clear.
Voron moved aside, hiding behind a rocky outcrop from which he could see the entire area. The shadow took up a position next to him, blending in with the shadow of the rock.
Laika was patient. She knew how to wait, and her instincts were sharper than those of humans. Now all that remained was to wait. Raven knew that Svetlana and Anatoly were now in camp, nervously gathering money and preparing for the final push.
They had received an unambiguous signal from Raven. Their logistics were in question. Their reaction had to be immediate.
No one throws away millions to flee along a dirty, unprotected trail, knowing that their trail could be discovered at any moment. It started to rain. At first it was light, drizzling, then heavy, a mountain downpour that immediately filled the air with the smell of wet earth and cedar needles. Voron sat motionless, ignoring the cold.
The rain was his ally. It would wash away all unnecessary traces and increase the tension in the criminals' camp. Each drop falling to the ground measured time. After what seemed like an endless hour to the Raven, he heard them.
Not footsteps, but the crunch of stones that could only be made by someone moving quickly, but carelessly. Someone possessed by haste and fear. Anatoly appeared first. He was wearing his thick mountain suit, and on his back hung the small but clearly heavy backpack, which undoubtedly contained 4 million rubles. He descended the path with a flashlight, its light darting across the stones. He did not look up, his gaze fixed only on the ground. Svetlana followed behind him at a distance. She was more cautious, moving more slowly, but her nervous tension was visible even from a distance. She carried her own lighter backpack, but her hands were free. Anatoly reached the broken trail. The light from his flashlight fell on a carelessly moved stone and a fresh boot print. He stopped abruptly. Raven saw his body tense up instantly. It was shock, caused not by surprise, but by rage. He realized that their perfect plan had fallen apart. Damn it! Anatoly's voice was muffled but clear. Svetlana, come here. Here. Svetlana quickly approached. She saw the stone, the footprint, and instantly understood. Voron watched them, holding his breath. They didn't look up or glance around. They were completely absorbed in their mistake. It's him, Svetlana hissed. That old man. He saw us here. He understood everything. We shouldn't have let him in. Shut up, Anatoly barked, his face contorted. He threw down his backpack, and Raven heard a dull, heavy thud. The money was in it. He didn't have time to call the police. Otherwise, they would already be here. He just wanted to scare us. Anatoly immediately set about correcting his mistake, furiously dragging away the flat stone and covering the shoe print with dirt. He worked quickly, almost feverishly, his breathing ragged and heavy. Svetlana stood over him, watching his actions, but her gaze kept slipping to the backpack with the money. Voron understood. This was their last act of self-confidence. They were sure that no one but them knew about this path, and that they had the advantage of time. They were sure that by correcting the trace, they would be able to leave quietly. Voron came out of his hiding place. He did it quietly, but deliberately, not silently. The shadow remained in place, its eyes like two yellow lights watching the scene. Anatoly and Svetlana turned around at the same time. They saw the raven standing above them like a ghost of the tiger, his rifle lowered, but his presence heavier than any weapon. There was no condemnation or triumph in his eyes, only cold, imperturbable calm. You are too hasty, said Voron, his voice low and even. The money is still here, but the prophet's body is there. Svetlana recoiled, her face turning ashen gray. Anatoly reacted instantly. He dropped the stone he was holding and his hand darted to his belt. Raven knew what was there. A knife, or, more likely, the same silent pistol that had killed Aristarch. Don't, said Raven. Your plan had logistics, but no redemption. The tension reached its peak. This was not just a skirmish. It was a clash between two worlds, a world ruled by greed and deceit, and a world where the harsh but honest order of the tiger reigned supreme. Raven was ready for the final change. The twilight of the mountain night was fastening in, but Raven didn't need light. He knew that fear and greed were the best lanterns for a criminal.
Treasurer Svetlana and Security Chief Anatoly, having discovered the broken trail, immediately went into flight mode.
Raven heard a muffled but insistent sound coming from the camp. Anatoly, who had previously been responsible for security, was now giving the sectarians their final instructions. which were probably couched in the form of spiritual guidance or
final initiation into the light. In reality, it was the signal for the start of their final shift.
Voron knew that they would take the money and try to get down to the ATV to leave via the abandoned road.
Their logic was simple and deadly.
Eliminate the only weakness they had discovered, the broken trail, and disappear immediately while the police were still at the camp. He remained in hiding, watching the trail. 20 minutes later, when the last sounds of singing in the camp had died down, two shadows appeared on the trail.
Anatoly moved first, carrying on his back the same heavy backpack in which Raven had already mentally counted 4 million rubles.
His gait was heavy but focused. He was armed, and his hand kept touching his belt, where, according to Voron's calculations, the silent murder weapon should have been.
Svetlana followed behind him, holding a small flashlight in her hand, the beam of which she constantly lowered to the ground. She was more nervous, her neat heel constantly slipping on the wet stones, and she had to cling to branches.
She was the brains, the organizer of this murder.
But at the critical moment, her physical weakness and fear betrayed her.
The Raven, blending in with the shadows of the rocky ledge, waited for them at the very spot where he had left his broken footprint. Anatoly, reaching him, stopped instantly. His lantern illuminated a carelessly moved stone and a fresh footprint, which he had tried to cover up half an hour ago.
Damn!
Anatoly hissed through clenched teeth, his voice sounding like a grind.
He's here again.
He knows we're coming down, Svetlana hissed, her breathing ragged with tension.
We should have gotten rid of him. He's alone. Just get rid of him.
Shut up,
Anatoly barked, throwing down his backpack.
The heavy bag of money fell with a dull thud onto the wet ground, becoming the center of their attention. We need to clean this place up. We can't leave any traces. If they find him, we're dead. Anatoly took a small, dark object from his belt. Raven was right. It was a construction gun, converted to fire bullets. A murder weapon. Anatoly looked around, his flashlight scanning the trees, searching for whoever had left the footprint.
But he was searching in the semi-darkness, not realizing that his enemy was part of the taiga itself. While Anatoly, in a fit of rage, bent down to cover the broken trail again, Raven took action. He knew he had only a second. He came out from behind the rock, relying on his knowledge of the terrain rather than his rifle. You won't be able to clear everything. Raven's voice sounded low and dry, like the crack of frost. Anatoly jumped up as if stung. He turned, raising his pistol, but his movement was too predictable. Taking advantage of the element of surprise and the terrain, Raven was closer than Anatoly expected. He did not engage in open combat.
Raven was a master of distraction and neutralization.
He threw a piece of dry moss at Anatoly, distracting him for just a split second. That was enough.
Raven took a sharp step to the side, using the unevenness of the rock to change his trajectory, and delivered a precise, calculated blow with the handle of his knife to the security chief's wrist. There was a dull, short thud.
The murder weapon slipped out of Anatoly's numb hand and fell onto the wet moss. Anatoly, massive but slow, roared in pain and tried to grab Raven with his other hand. But Raven had already jumped back, using his speed and agility.
Svetlana, standing aside, watched what was happening with undisguised horror, but her instincts were directed not at helping her accomplice,
but at saving the money. While Anatoly struggled with his numb hand, she rushed to the backpack lying on the ground. "The money, Anatoly! The money!" she shouted, trying to lift the heavy bag. Voron ignored her and focused on disarming Anatoly. He knew that even without a gun, the head of security was still a formidable opponent. Seeing that his plan had failed, Anatoly lunged at Voron, trying to knock him off his feet and regain control of the gun. But Raven did not fight by the rules of the street. He used his knowledge of the laws of the taiga. He stepped back sharply, allowing Anatoly to miss and crash into an old, rotten stump that was hidden in the shadows. Anatoly lost his balance, fell, and hit his head on a wet boulder. He didn't lose consciousness, but he was stunned. At that moment, Svetlana finally picked up the backpack with 4 million rubles and, leaving Anatoly behind, tried to run up the path toward the camp, hoping to blend in with the cultists and the police. But she didn't take one thing into account: Shadow. The Raven let her run only a few meters. Then he gave Shadow an order that she understood without words. Laika, moving silently like a shadow, circled Svetlana. She did not attack the treasurer. She simply stood in her way, blocking her path. The shadow did not bark or growl. She just looked at Svetlana with her yellow, predatory eyes. And that was enough. Svetlana stopped dead in her tracks and stared in horror at the dog, which seemed to be part of the forest itself. Her breathing became convulsive. 4 million rubles lay at her feet. She was trapped. In front of her was Shadow. Behind her was Raven and the stunned Anatoly. Raven approached Anatoly. The head of security, breathing heavily, tried to get up. Raven picked up the gun lying on the moss and put it in his pocket. He looked at the 2 accomplices now kneeling, one defeated by force, the other defeated by fear and greed, which prevented her from throwing away the money. They had upset the balance of the taiga for 4 million, and now it was taking back what was owed to it. This was not just a capture. It was the final shift, a change in the order that they could not control. Anatoly, stunned by the blow to the rock, was breathing heavily, trying to regain control of his body. He was powerful, trained, but his instincts, designed for fighting in the city or in the gym, were useless against Voron, who moved according to the laws of the taiga. Voron stood over him like the punishing force of this wild place itself. Svetlana, pinned to the backpack with the money by the husky Shadow, was completely paralyzed. Her face was pale, her eyes showing not remorse, but pure animal panic at the fact that her flawless, calculated plan had collapsed because of this silent man and his dog. The 4 million rubles for which they had committed murder lay between her and Tenia, becoming not an instrument of salvation, but an anchor that chained her to the scene of the crime. Voron was in no hurry. He knew that fear now worked better than any handcuffs. He approached Svetlana. "You thought it was just logistics," said the Raven, his voice quiet but penetrating. "You thought that if you removed the body and covered your tracks, you would remove the mistake itself." Svetlana couldn't speak, only shaking her head frantically. "You have broken the law of the taiga," Voron continued. He was not talking about the laws of the state or morality. He was talking about something more ancient and immutable. This world lives in balance. Every element, from cedar to moss, knows its place. You brought lies and greed here. You killed to gain power and money. But greed is a diseased element,
And nature always removes diseased elements to restore balance.
Anatoly finally came to his senses and, leaning on his elbow, tried to reach for the boulder to use it as a weapon. The raven simply turned his head in his direction. There was something in his gaze that made the chief of security freeze.
Not a threat, but absolute certainty that resistance was futile. "I am not a judge, nor am I an executioner," said Raven, addressing both of them, but his words seemed to be directed at the entire tiger. "I'm just restoring order. You, Anatoly, thought that your survival experience and knowledge of equipment would give you power over this place. You, Svetlana, thought that your accounting skills would give you power over people and money, but you forgot the most important thing: honesty." He nodded toward the backpack. "These 4 million are not your salvation. They are the price of your transgression. You thought that by hiding behind faith and collective psychosis, you could convince everyone that the prophet had ascended. But the trail on the ground does not lie. The body in the pit does not lie. And the journal you hid, Svetlana, does not lie. Your logistics were perfect, but your ethics was zero. And that was your downfall." Svetlana suddenly tried to hide. She turned away from Raven, from Shadow, pressing her back against the wet stone. It was a senseless, instinctive movement, an attempt to hide in a world where she had nowhere to go. Voron addressed Shadow, not with words, but with a short, almost imperceptible gesture. Laika understood. She did not attack, but slowly, methodically circled Svetlana, cutting off her escape route. Her actions were precise and non-aggressive, but completely excluded any possibility of movement. Shadow just watched, and in that gaze the treasurer saw a reflection of her own fear. "He won't let you escape," said Raven. "You violated my peace for money, and now I am collecting that debt from you." He walked over to the backpack. He picked it up. The heavy bag of cash, wrapped in tarpaulin, was cold and damp. It was a material, dirty reality that shattered the mystical legend of the ascent. Anatoly, seeing the raven take the money, finally broke down. There was no more rage in his eyes, only despair, and the realization that they had lost everything. "He wanted it all for himself!" Anatoly shouted hoarsely, pointing at Svetlana. "She made it all up! She bought the gun!" "She talked me into it." Svetlana, without turning around, began to shake, her back pressed against the rock. In this wild mountain gorge, in the presence of a man who was part of this harsh nature, their partnership ended, turning into a dirty, selfish denunciation. "It doesn't matter who came up with it," Voron cut in. "What matters is who broke it, and you both broke it." He didn't tie them up or guard them. There was no need. Anatoly was defeated, and his greed could no longer overcome his fear and pain. Svetlana was rooted to the spot by her lies and her terror of the shadow. Voron took the satellite phone out of his pocket, the purchase of which Svetlana had so diligently hidden in her journal. He dialed the only number he knew by heart. "Ignat," he said, addressing Major Sobolev. "Come here. You need a medical examiner and 2 witnesses. I have the prophet's body in the tunnel, mark 830. I have the murder weapon, and I have both culprits, as well as 4 million rubles." He turned off the phone. In the ensuing silence, broken only by the sound of rain and the heavy breathing of the criminals, Voron looked at Shamanka. The mountain stood,
unperturbed and indifferent to the small tragedy that had just unfolded at its foot.
Order had been restored, but he knew that this victory was temporary. Human greed does not disappear. It only finds new forms and new, sick elements the tiger will have to extract, again and again.
He waited for dawn and the arrival of civilization, which was supposed to take away its vultures. The rain subsided at dawn, leaving behind fresh, clean air and wet stones that glistened in the first rays of the sun. The raven waited.
Anatoly sat on the ground, leaning against a boulder, his head bowed, his strong arm with which he had tried to reach for his gun, now hanging limply.
Svetlana, still pressed against the rock, sobbed quietly and frantically, her tears mixing with the dirt on her face. Next to them lay a heavy backpack with 4 million rubles. Order had been restored, but the price they had paid for it was obvious. Major Sobolev arrived 3 hours later. He did not come alone. With him were 2 operatives, a medical examiner, and 2 civilians who served as witnesses. They climbed the trail, cursing the steep ascent and the mud. Voron met them at the fork in the road without saying a word. His mere presence, as well as the silent shadow sitting next to him, immediately put the police in the right frame of mind. The mysticism was over. Sobolev, seeing Raven, immediately understood that the case was closed. His gaze slid over Raven, his backpack, and then to the gun in his hand, which Raven immediately put away. "Did you find everything?" asked the major, his voice hoarse with fatigue and tension. Voron did not answer with words. He simply nodded toward Anatoly and Svetlana, who, now that they saw people in uniform, had completely lost their pride. "Money." Voron pointed to the backpack, the murder weapon, the logbook with all the plans, and the body. "Over there." He waved his hand toward the tunnel. "In the pit." Major Sobolev did not ask any unnecessary questions. He knew that Raven always gave a complete, comprehensive report, but only once and only on the essentials. Following the major's instructions, the operatives immediately proceeded to arrest the treasurer and the head of security. The witnesses, people from the nearest village, were shocked by the scene. A respectable, devout woman and a strong man, who just a day earlier had been talking about Ascension, now stood hunched over in shame and fear next to a backpack stuffed with cash. The forensic expert and one of the operatives went to the tunnel. Half an hour later, they returned. Their faces were grim. The discovery of the body of Prophet Aristarch, killed at point-blank range with a construction pistol, completely destroyed the legend of his mystical disappearance. It was not metaphysics, but a dirty, banal crime. Voron handed Major Sobolev all the evidence. A leather logbook that fully revealed the logistics of the deception and the killer's plans. The murder weapon, a modified pistol that guaranteed silence, and a backpack with money. He did not lecture the major or the detainees. He simply restored balance. "The prophet's body and the money he collected will be returned to the people," said Voron. "This is your world. You restore it." Major Sobolev, a practical man tired of paperwork, couldn't help but feel respect for this unsociable but honest man. "Thank you, Raven," said the major. "This is not an accident. It's murder, and it would not have been solved if it weren't for you." "We will have to—" "No, you don't," Raven interrupted him. "My work is done." He glanced back at the sect's camp. Captain Kostin, surrounded by a group of exalted followers, was still trying to explain to them that their prophet had not ascended, but had been killed for money. But the cultists weren't listening.
Their faces were still lit up with the same fanatical, reverent faith. They didn't want to hear about logistics, money, or a corpse in a tunnel. They chose a myth that was sweeter and purer to them than the dirty, criminal truth.
Raven gave them a contemptuous look. They were the sick element, not because they believed, but because they refused to accept the truth when it lay at their feet. They preferred a beautiful lie to an ugly reality. He turned and walked away.
The shadow, like an inseparable companion and faithful guardian, followed him. They walked along the same path they had come, back to their world, to their hut, to their secluded order. Major Sobolev called out to him, but Raven did not turn around.
He did not belong to their world and did not need their recognition.
The murder had been solved, evil punished, the money found. But Raven knew that justice, like order, was a temporary state. New vultures, new prophets, and new greedy souls would inevitably appear. Human nature, obsessed with greed, would always find a way to upset the balance. He left, dissolving into the taiga, leaving behind the noise of the city and its laws. Behind him were the cries of the detainees, the bustle of the police, and the monotonous chants of the sectarians who continued to believe in the ascension of their leader, despite the evidence. There was a quiet sadness that permeated his return.
He had restored order, but he had not redeemed human nature. And that, Raven knew, was impossible. He returned to his world, where the only law was honesty, and the only judge was the taiga.